I'm really curious to talk about this new book of yours, Christ is Belial. Very controversial title. Um, I think I just want to start by asking, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to say Christ is Belial?
Well, it means that there's a false dualism, a false dichotomy occurring. If you understand the, the Hegelian dialectical is a way of corralling humans into choices that they wouldn't otherwise make, but making them feel like they did it of their own free will, creating false dichotomies, choices between false boundaries like communism and capitalism is the same kind of psychological technique. And so they did that with the creation of a Christ figure and then an Antichrist figure. And what I didn't realize is that they were the same figure until I was several years into the research, and thanks to the discoveries of Dr. Uh, Robert Eisenman and his prodigal student, Daniel T. Unterbrink.
So when you say, okay, so in terms of, let's go back a little bit to the history here. I've interviewed Joseph Atwill, and he expounds the idea of the Caesars, basically like Josephus, who was a court historian um, for the Caesars of that late the Flavians, right? And essentially saying that Josephus and company wrote the New Testament. Um, is but before that, there do seem to be real figures, right? That are the model for Jesus, right? There were real
Yes,
figures, and
yes,
yeah, there's even the twins idea that there was one brother that was a zealot and the other one that was an Essene, and that's why you have these contradictions in the New Testament, where at one moment Jesus is saying, basically give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, because I'm involved only in the spiritual life. I don't care about the material world. And then you've got the zealot that goes in there and overturns the money changers' tables in the temple, right? So there's two different beings that got merged into one. Is
yes,
that your hypothesis?
yes. I would say at least two different. I mean, it's a real suicide cola of personas, including Paul's Apollonius of Tyana, James, Judas, and then everyone knows about the ties to Apollo and the ancient pagan figures that he was also tied to. But yes, it was. There's a lot that went into this anthropomorphical figure, but they didn't, and it would be inconsistent with everything that Rome did against the human species if they did invent this from scratch. They typically aren't that smart. But what they typically do is their method of operation is to take ingenious movements that were forged against them and then invert them for their own purpose. And it looks like that's what they did here, is they took an anthropomorphical figure that already had legs in people's mind, which was Belial, and then told us through black magic disclosure and ritual substitution in Second Corinthians who the God of this world is, um, who the false dichotomy is, and and then riddles us what does the unbeliever and the believer have in common. Right after he asks us what does Jesus and Belial have in common, and then he answers that in the same Second Corinthians in chapter 11:14, where he tells us, "Don't you know, like silly, don't you know the adversary always, or not always, but poses as masquerades as an angel of light?" And who do Christians think that angel of light is? Some subordinate?
They would think Lucifer is the false light, right? And then there is this notion. I think you're not. I mean, I've heard this theory throughout time that Christ Lucifer is essentially the same being, right? Well, but it's part of the embodiment. I mean, this kind of gets to, I think, what you're talking about is false dualism, and my perspective is more. There's a lot of traditions that understand this, that really there is no opposition between God and the devil, because the devil works for God. Otherwise, God is not all powerful. And so, of course, the devil serves God. Of course, the fallen ones are a servant of the one God. But once, as you talk about, there's a difference with, obviously, within different theologies. Those that want it to become, a dark versus light, God versus Satan, right? Christ versus Satan, as opposed to the unification idea, which is no, all the fallen, all the darkness still serves the oneness.
Yes. It's definitely a false dualism that funnels people into a unification, just like communism and capitalism. A lot of people, this isn't in my book, but the same organization that invented this false narrative is behind every ism that was ever made that funneled us into the scenarios that we're in right now. I mean, they overthrew China and beta tested communism there first. Or, I'm sorry, was it first?
No, it was the Russian Empire first.
Right. So Paul Warburg of the Federal Reserve was the front man for the Vatican that financed the Bolshevik Revolution. That's a fact. That's not a theory. And once he realized that he was working with the same organization Queen Elizabeth and the Bonesmen were working with when they price dumped cheap opium into a pre-Mao Zedong China, that was the second beta test of the same um, death cult, global death cult operating through England after they bankrupted England with the Rothschilds. So it's a very crafty organization. It creates fake Jewish fronts to operate through so that we're confused about who our common enemy is. But 500 years ago, right before the Jesuits were invented, the average illiterate peasant could have told you who our common enemy is as a species, clearly. And now the average person with a master's degree will argue that it's all kinds of different organizations except the church.
Yeah, so you see it as the church, which is really an extension of the ancient Roman Empire, and it morphed into the Holy Roman Empire and the Vatican and all this.
I think
Uh,
it goes back to the Babylonian,
the
uh,
mysteries.
the people who leveled the first temple, the first Solomon building, and the Twin Towers. Um, that Tisha B'Av event, that very first initial Tisha B'Av event in Hebrew culture, the temple leveling in 587 BC, was a ritual that changed the whole culture through genocide and exile, and then rewrote their Bible. And we see a consistent thing where every time an authentic human rebellion happens to this death cult, they rewrite their template and then come out with a demonological teacher's key to help the teachers of the first text teach it properly. And so that's a pattern that I noticed later. But they're that old, and they apparently discovered the necessity for creating this psychological operation after the first resistance movement by the Sons of Light and Pythagoras.
I see. And as far as in terms of your book, you lay out the idea of essentially these guys are creating dualistic realities, right? Of as you say, death cults, essentially. Can you explain more in terms of what the antithesis of that worldview would look like?
The antithesis of what they hope happens, that would be
Yeah,
the fourth. That
what's
would be
different?
the Pythagorean revolution that was completely blacked out for 150 years after he was assassinated, and his group was assassinated. Many of them were burned alive in homes where they were meeting, having meetings.
And what did that look like? I mean, for those that aren't familiar with Pythagoras, and essentially their secret society, what was it? What was it about?
Well, it was only a secret because they were operating against the dawn of the monetary system, which was their antithesis. But the fourth philosophy in the Pythagorean movement that came 600 years before that was a completely moneyless movement with no flesh consumption whatsoever and no forms of mental coercion, mind control, which is the precursor for the word gubermente, government. So the way to easily remember the three most important concepts that the Pythagoreans taught were, remember them as the three M's: no meat, no money, and no mind control. And these three M's turn up later in the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Hmm.
which were written by the same community that was scared for their lives, that were exiled into the desert at Qumran. And what they put together in the Dead Sea Scrolls was they explained that there was a demon that was running the minds of the people that were opposing them, that were trying to create the monetary system. They referred to them as the sons of Belial. And this name goes back to the beginning of Hebrew scripture, at least 1,000 years older than this, at least maybe 2,000 years older than than when the Dead Sea Scroll people were writing about Belial. But they thought he was a real thing, and it had legs. It had real legs, and it caught people through a pyramid scheme of fishing for men and then turning people into other fishers of men. And it used three specific nets of capture, and they were the three M's: meat, money, and mind control. So if you got in bed with the government or any lower god than the creator of souls, then you were participating in the fornication net. And if you participated in the monetary system by even touching money, then you were caught in the net of chasing false value and wealth and money, mammon. And then the third net was fornication, money, and ritual pollution of the temple. And they didn't mean that on the macro. They meant that as the body. So any type of following bad dietary wisdom, and their dietary wisdom was really solid. It was based on the Pythagorean diet. That's why they didn't eat like Jews. They did not touch meat at all. And that's why James was spoken about by Eusebius and Hegesippus, that he never touched meat from birth. And Christian apologists try to separate the household of James and Jesus into two separate households with two sisters, both named Mary, to try to justify why one was raised on an all food is blessed diet and the other one was strict with his diet, and why that mattered. They don't want people to think it even mattered, right? Because what this operation is supposed to do is create one of the biggest nets of ritual pollution that's cast by this demon that they threw the costume of Christ over. And so it was really smart for Paul to think of this. And it was wicked smart for him to use black magic disclosure to tell people in 2 Corinthians 6:14 exactly what he was doing. And then again in 11:14 for those that didn't catch it on the first pass.
I always have trouble with this argument that that essentially the Christ figure was completely concocted by the ruling empire, because why even divulge so much of these teachings? As far as we talk about, there is this there are certain aspects within the teachings of Christ in the New Testament that have to do with again the spiritual path, not engaging with the money system, essentially, right? Not bringing the money system into the temple. Not try, how do you say, essentially separating the spiritual from the physical world. There does seem to be there are a lot of parables and teachings which are giving succor and health, spiritual health to people that follow the actual teachings of Christ. So why even divulge that if it's all about mind control, about keeping people in a state of, I guess you could argue like that's the same reason why slaves were taught Christianity, say that like you'll get what's coming to you in heaven, but for now you have to suffer. I mean, I guess what is the motivation of divulging these teachings at all?
That's something that was really interesting to me too. So I started researching black magic and demonology to understand why practitioners, people who literally build malware in what they understood to be the Ethernet, before anyone understood what internet malware was. These guys were creating demons from scratch. They were that smart, and these things, once they were put into the ether, and with enough people ritually believing in them, it would create its own autonomous state of being that didn't require any more input from the original designer. And so these people were so smart that they could create things like that, thought forms like that had lasting, growing, autonomous power. And but Paul didn't do that. He put one over one that already existed. And I'm sorry, I think I lost your question. Could you repeat what part I missed in the answer?
Yeah, no, what I was saying is that they're still divulging very important spiritual teachings through the Christ figure, right? So and some of the teachings are even from the Hindu Vedas, for example. A lot of some of the parables are very similar to the parables from the Hindu Vedas. So it's like there's a spiritual aspect of these teachings that are helpful to people. So
absolutely.
Why divulge them?
And maybe I misunderstood. When you say why divulge them, you mean why say something that might screw them up by saying the association between Christ and Belial, or do you mean why tell people good stuff that helps them in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I was going to answer the question, I would suggest that it's the same reason that slaves during the American slave experience, right? Um, uh, Black slaves were taught Christianity, and
Yes,
a
yes,
lot of times it was actually to basically make them passive, to say, well, you know, it's all about suffering in this life because the glory is in the next life, right? The
yes,
salvation comes in the next life. Is that the
yes,
reason for this?
yes. It's about creating an indebtedness in the mind, an anchoring is what a hypnotist would call it. But this technology's been around for as long as hypnotism, and I found that out when I was researching the best evidence that we have that there's legitimacy to astral travel through hypnosis and having a proper medium to do this type of hypnosis. And I was like, man, this just sounds like crap, right? And then I started getting into the research of how communism was started, and I realized that John Dee, the lead espionage agent for Queen Elizabeth, that was his whole gig. And she used him like a one trick pony. She got major stuff done using him and his medium. And so that's when I really started to peek up to what's going on there. And this is before I met my wife, who does this for a living. The reason that I was able to swoon her on a date was because I actually had some background knowledge of what she does as a hypnotist, and I got to bounce questions off her that just sounded crazy to me from the books that I've been reading. And she said, "Yes, that's textbook." And I said, "Have you read any of the books that I've read?" She said, "No." And I was like, well, "How'd you get your clinical, certification overseas and not know anything about these people that taught me about the eternal soul and where we go next, and that we have free will choices to come back and all that stuff?" And she was like, "Nick, it doesn't matter who the practitioner is. It doesn't matter who the patient is. The results of the testimony from what happens when we pass is always the same from these people. It's never in conflict." And so I was just like, shit, that's scientific methodology. And so then it dawned on me as I was continuing down the Christian rabbit hole that these people knew this stuff before, well, in fact, probably a couple thousand years before they ever thought of inventing the Abrahamic religions. And those Abrahamic religions were stolen from the Brahmic religions. That's not just a misassociation. Those two words. They
That,
basically
yeah,
stole a template to rule a different culture.
that's what I wanted to get into next. Exactly, was the Old Testament, which we know was really written and rewritten in Babylon, right? Or let's say consolidated in Babylon. Have you dived into this, or is this your next book?
Oh
Essentially.
yeah, I live with a woman who speaks fluent Hebrew, so I know the places where they inserted a fake crucifixion prophecy into the original Hebrew scripture in the Tanakh. I can name two of them from heart and quote what they were and what they are now to prove what the criminal organization did. And they left at least three poop stains where they did it that are incontrovertible.
Mhm.
But go ahead.
Yeah, so let's talk about it in terms of not just the crucifix. I mean, again, there's obviously the Jews don't believe Christ was a Messiah, right? That's the disconnect between Judaism and Christianity. But more importantly, you mentioned oftentimes utilizing the Jews for purposes of scapegoating and to be kind of obviously there's a lot of Jewish influence we realize in banking, in media, um, and obviously into politics. So, uh, what is like? Does this go back to the origins of the mind control cult, essentially creating, or let's say, utilizing the Old Testament as a type of model or modality? Like how did that work?
They stole something from a people and then they reformed the template into something that they could demonically control them through. And then they released a demonic teacher's key for the practitioners of this enterprise on the unsuspecting that went in parallel with each new biblical template that was released. And this started with the Book of Enoch and then continued with the introduction of the Testament of Solomon, right when the first New Testaments were coming out from canon. They made sure that they came out with the demonological teacher's key right with it. And I was like, man, this has got to be just maybe this is coincidence, right? So what are the chances that it happened again when the Protestant Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, all that happened because people learned to read. And so the Jesuits were invented because people learning to read was a problem. And so they needed to step up their intelligence game. And so right when all that happened, the Jesuits were invented, and the Jesuits figured out that they're either going to have an opposition movement or they're going to create one. And so they created Protestantism to double their sphere of influence. And that was the first major psychological operation of the Jesuits, was to create the Protestant Reformation. And the Bible, that was going to be the most well-read Bible in history for a newly
The King
literate.
James, the King James.
King James. So, these people left a huge clue. King James wrote demonology 4 years, 6 years, 7 years before he endorsed the King James version of the Bible. So these people are in bed together, all of them. But what King James didn't do is give too much information about the categorization and identification of these demons, because he didn't want to demonstrate so much knowledge that they'd burn him at the stake for it. So he just let people know that they're real, and he warned them about how they operate. And then his Bible came out. And then right after that, the real teacher's key came out, one of the most important ones that ever existed. And it came out about the time that that the Roman organization realized that they needed to step it up even further than the King James template, and they needed to censor out the most dangerous 14 books to reduce it to a 66-book template. And all that happened within 100 years. But right in the middle of that decision, how do we accomplish this, and then accomplishing the reduction to 66, they came out with the Ars Goetia, the lesser key of Solomon, which is the demonological teacher's key. And in that, they describe who operates a 66 legion template, which is the king of all demons, the one who rules the other 71. And if you remember, there's 72 names of God. And El presided over a committee I think it was in Genesis.
72 Elohim, right? 72 Elohim.
Right. Well, 70 Elohim. There's a missing one. Mm-hmm. So there's El and the 70, but there's 72. And the missing one is likely the adversary. But either way, the 72 number is really important. There's 72 amens in the first major New Testament that came out, which is a kind of endorsement or signature that people give without reading the fine print. It's something that's kind of convulsive and evoked. That may have sign here, sign here, sign. There were 72 of those, and I think in the Latin Vulgate. Anyway, I'm digressing. That's not in my book. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, how these are. It's fascinating again how the manipulation of light can be done by this force. Would you say this is an intent? Okay, would you say this is a demonic force that's behind this, or are these actors aware of this is obviously a multi-generational conspiracy. So would you say this is a demonic force behind it?
Unfortunately, yes. I think it's a real soulless, no soul, nothing scary, nothing we should be afraid of, because we're a soul. So we're the most powerful thing in this. We're the scariest, most powerful thing in this whole realm. We just don't know it, right? And these mechanical beings, they feed off of something that's like gold to them. The soul's fractured energy, luge, if you will. And so it doesn't have to happen. It's something that we step into of our own free will. And so a lot of the contradictions in the Bible are there on purpose as black magic disclosures. One of my favorite is the Garden of Eden. We're obviously designed at our most basic level to be plant eaters. And this always pisses people off that eat meat, because they're not really thinking without hijackers being in charge. And it's hard to explain that to people. But the way to get rid of all the hijackers is to get rid of what they eat, which is what you are made of, flesh. It's a real problem when you feed these things what you're made of, because it teaches them how to eat you later, and trains them to want to eat you later. And our Western medicine doesn't teach us that, because we're in the middle of a biological warfare campaign that's biblical. It's that old. And they've known for that long that it changes our consciousness and makes us want to be fenced in, because we're afraid of the pig next to us, because the pigs are eating steaks. And most people don't understand this, but we have a pig's digestive system. You can Google this, and I'm 100% right. There's no other animal on the planet that shares the pig's digestive system, but we do. And if you leave your child with a pig that's been raised on plants, you can leave it there all day and that pig won't do anything but play with it and love it, right? But if you leave a child with a full-grown pig that eats meat, you'll be gone for 30 minutes and the kid will be gone, because that's what happens to us when we eat meat. It literally has a neurological change and makes us unable to rule ourselves. It makes us do things that require governments. And so the Babylonians figured this out when Pythagoras was teaching people how to free themselves. And so they knocked down the temple, they rebuilt the temple, and then they made it a meat market. But they said that you can't eat meat. They said, okay, we'll admit that meat's unclean, but meat's not clean. Meat is clean if you bring it in and you pay us, and our priest blesses it. Then it's kosher. And so our kosher dietary laws that were given to us was the visiting, not the visiting team, was the death cult's response to the Pythagorean attempt to reach humanity with the right diet. And so they came out with the black magic document that made sure that we ate meat and paid them to eat meat. And that the only food that kind of meat they were allowed to eat was the kind that was blessed at the temple. So the temple became a slaughterhouse with channels of blood running out of it. And so that lasted for 500 years, 550 years, until the sons of light in the desert had enough. And they started rebelling. And so decades before the supposed birth of Jesus, Rome realized they had one of the biggest social demonstration problems that they've ever come across that couldn't be squashed because these people were anti-money, and a system that required censorship, a census and taxation to continue to exist, and a monetary system to continue to exist, could not have a movement that was trying to free people from the monetization of human thought. But they were, the fourth philosophy was unsuccessful at reaching us with that. The most important thing that they did to reach us that couldn't be erased by Rome is the legacy of the second temple cleansing. Rome did a good job of almost getting rid of the first temple cleansing, where Judas the Galilean knocks the golden temple off of the pinnacle and gets arrested by Herod's men, and miraculously he gets out again after Herod dies and starts his real campaign against Rome, which leads to his emboldened second temple cleansing, which Rome couldn't erase from history at all. And if people knew who did the second temple cleansing, or if people knew who did the first temple cleansing, they would know who did the second temple cleansing, because it's the same person. But the legacy that he was leaving is: get money out of your temple. Don't even touch that crap. It's the root of all evil. And look what Christianity did with the story. I mean, that's something Rome couldn't have even invented. That story. It was such a powerful legacy that could not be erased. It was genius, really, that Judas did that, even though it led to his crucifixion. But look what Rome did with it. Look what they did with the story of Judas. They made him the purse carrier for the apostles. Now, and then the one that sold out the literary invention that they made to put over Belial. And they did all of it as the foundation of the banking system. Now, you couldn't be more satanic than that. And I've known that for 4 or 5 years, but it was only a couple of years ago that I discovered the power of black magic, ritual substitution, and disclosure that Paul was demonstrating, if Paul existed. I'm not sure he did, but regardless of whether he existed or not, his insertion into history has created a persona that we can refer to as a real person, just for the sake of being able to get somewhere with this information.
So the substitution, meaning you basically take the hero and turn him into the villain?
Taking the truth and replacing it with Folgers crystals.
With the false light.
Yeah, basically, but telling you what they're doing at the same time. So, but what's hidden behind all of it is Christianity never tells people that they have a soul. They imply it. They imply that if you behave, then you'll be with Jesus in heaven forever. How is that possible if you're not a soul, right? Maybe with a resurrected body, but you see how the effort that they're making to avoid talking about the soul? And so if you dig into the Bible, you find out that, I don't know if there ever was a place, but there's definitely not a place in the Bible now where the God of the Bible even plays around with the idea that he created the soul. It talks about inhaling and then exhaling the spirit of life into the body that he created, but then he negates that was an invention by saying, I think it was in Jeremiah or Zechariah, that I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb, implying that we are something else that existed before this format, and that he knew us, like there was a relationship that had developed before he put us into this physical form, which the God of the Bible likely did create. The demiurge likely did create these bodies. But what they don't want us to know is that that immortal spark that we're carrying within us, that is a limitless energy source for this demonic enterprise. But it only works if we walk into it of our own free will. So it has to tell us what it's doing at some level, even if it's kind of like under the table. It has to say what it's doing. And so it tells us that eating outside of the garden, the diet that we had in the garden, is a fall from grace and is a result of other bad decisions that we made. But then Christians say, well, we're just going to eat bad because we're in the fall from grace. And it's just like, what? That's how that works. But then in Isaiah, they let that information in there that the only way that righteousness is ever going to return to the earth is when all these things that are eating each other right now stop and start turning to a plant-based diet. And even the lion will eat straw. And that one always baked my noodle. Like, what are they? What's the disclosure there? That's a huge contradiction. And then I found out it's not a contradiction. It's black magic disclosure. They're telling us the right diet, the fall from the right diet, and then how to go back to the right diet. And then Jesus shows up and says, hey, all fruit is blessed. And don't even wash your hands before you eat whatever you want. There's nothing you can put in your body that can harm you.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's the weird thing in terms of, with the pigs, it's like the reason it's kosher to not eat swine is that pigs are so close to us, as far as genetically, right? That it's not very clean for us to eat our cousin, essentially, right?
It's probably the best evidence as to why monkeys are still monkeys and we're not monkeys anymore. Something messed around with us. But regardless of that argument, we have a pig's digestive system.
Yeah.
And we know it's tied to our brain.
Yeah.
And so
I was just saying that the interesting thing is that there's a reason, at least, that halal and kosher, saying don't eat swine, and basically because it's too close to you genetically. But Christ doesn't continue that. So Christians are happy to eat pig. And as you say, like there's these things that are coming in that now there's a new documentary that's supposed to come out, to your point about Christ being a vegetarian, or along with the Essenes, that whole community. Right?
It's already out. It's called Christspiracy.com.
Christspiracy. Yes, Christspiracy.
You can download it for free. And that's why I didn't spend a lot of time on that in my book, because it's already been done better than I probably could have done it. So I focused on money in my book, since diet's already been covered.
Yes.
And I focused on government, which is something that everybody needs to understand, that we can't vote our way out of the problems that we have. The only reason that we're in these problems is because we believe in voting, which is a form of submission to tyranny. And so we have to take back our sovereignty. We have to decentralize control, and have a decentralist philosophy as a collective. And what these people figured out back in 2,000 years ago is that we're supposed to be living in camps that are about the size of a large high school, or maybe a little larger. Basically a Roman legion. They figured that out for the same reason. You can't have more than that number of people together without there being septic problems and food sourcing problems and other things. But 5,000 seems to be a good sweet spot for a camp. And if that camp should be so self-sufficient that there's no reason to import anything. And so, once you start thinking like this, you start eliminating the need for road systems. The earth comes back to life. We stop looking like cancerous tumors on the earth, and we start looking like indigenous camps that take care of each other, that go back to a natural law way of life, that don't need hospitals because we're not sick anymore. And We don't have to have slaughterhouses anymore because people are all back on a very diverse plant-based diet, which you can't even imagine trying to do that in this environment. Because if you go, I don't care how healthy of a place you seek out in town, anywhere except maybe California, the whole menu everywhere you go is carcasses and salads. And that's not a way for a vegan or a Pythagorean aesthetic diet person to sustain themselves. So literally the infrastructure has been set up for people that are trying to live right or righteous to fail. And so the extraordinary effort that someone has to go through to get the food that they need in this environment and the money they have to pay. Whew. My book is literally making sure that my family can eat organic, healthy produce. That's about all it's paying for right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think the sequel to your book, as I mentioned, the Old Testament, would be very fascinating to see how you dive into the how this manipulation started. As you mentioned, taking the Brahmic tradition and warping it into the Abrahamic tradition. No?
Yeah, it's an ancient Chaldean black magic cult that figured out how to control people, and they never lost control. They just changed forms whenever it was necessary. So they don't care what flag flies over our country. The double-headed phoenix of the church will always emerge from the ashes after any catastrophe. And we are programmed to let those catastrophes happen ritually, which is part of our MK Ultra Revelation programming. Revelation was designed to make us submit to the prophecies of Christ and the government whenever the government abuses us through fires and wars and any kind of atrocity you can think of. People look at the sky and say, "It was written about. This is exactly this is what Christ said would happen. So we just got to go with it." And they've been erasing the Etch-a-Sketch over and over and over again throughout history and rebuilding on a bigger and bigger bulwark of infrastructure each time until they got into the control that they have today through the United States, which they built. A lot of people don't know that. They think that there was some time when we were sovereign, but the Capitol building is the Vatican.
Hmm.
I mean, if you look at it, it's the same building. So like the idea that we were once free and then got caught somehow into this system they don't understand it. It's we were built by Freemasons, and Freemasons are the sons of Belial, the sons of darkness that were talked about in all the ancient scriptures. They've been around since Egypt and Chaldea, and they never lost control. It's a Luciferian organization, but what a lot of people don't understand is that Lucifer and Belial are likely the same character.
Sure.
But when it was important that they put this Christ figure over something that already existed, Paul chose Belial, clearly. And I'm not trying to be special, but the most special thing I've ever done in my research is discover make that discovery and the statement out loud. I don't think anybody else ever has, is that this clearly is what Paul did, or the people that invented Paul did. And this demon has behaved exactly like it used to ever since. And it's still using the same three nets of pollution to keep people in the muck and mire of false duality, Hegelian dialectical, funneling people coercing people into an outcome that no one would ever choose for themselves. And people don't realize that they're doing it of their own free will. And the research of Dr. Michael Newton is the easiest place for people to access what I mean by free will, the eternal soul, how we got here in the first place. We don't remember it, but it's a game. It's an educational game board. If you've ever had the feeling it's a game, well, I mean, you bleed, but it is a game, and you're going to survive it no matter how ugly it gets. And you're going to be able to look back on this as one of the most profound educational experiences you've ever had. And it's likely that you'll be so attracted to it, if you haven't done it enough times, that you'll be back.
Right. Well, the cycling of souls, which
Right.
the real Christ talked about, but again, that was hidden by the Vatican as well.
Right. He said that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah, maybe?
Could be. But in terms of the reincarnation thing, it's I can't remember. I'm not sure if it's the Nag Hammadi or if it's in the apocryphal books that were basically kept out. there were other teachings, other testaments that were hidden by the Vatican, like the Book of Enoch and others.
And Hinduism isn't off the hook. They have Belial, I found out. His name is Raul or something. I think I have that written down. Yeah, his name is Rahu, Rahu. Rahu is who Belial is in the Hindu culture. And the people that invented the Bible also invented Islam in 670 AD with Khadijah and Muhammad, who was British royalty.
Mm-hmm.
And
how do you know he was British royalty?
Well, I didn't know that until Sam Tripoli, Joe Rogan's best friend, informed me of it in the middle of our first interview back in 2020. And that's on my YouTube channel if you guys want to go back to that and see who he's referencing. But he discloses his sources there. I don't have that in front of me, but I chased it, and he's right. The same organization that beta tested the Christological concept on the human species tried to do even better with their second effort with the children of Ishmael. So they did this with the children of Isaac. They Christianized them, and then with the children of Ishmael, so they could control the other half of the population in that area. They took them over with the story of Khadijah and Muhammad. Khadijah was a nun that her very wealthy husband died and did something unconventional where he left Khadijah all the money. And so the Pope kind of held its breath and looked at her sideways and waited to see if she was going to do the right thing. And she did. She gave all the wealth to the Pope because a widow wasn't supposed to have that kind of wealth or power or something like that. And so they made her an honorary nun and put her in a convent. And then after, she proved herself to be loyal, they pulled her out and asked her to do a very elitist role where she was going to play the wife of the next Messiah for the children of Ishmael. And so they married her to a British royal who was, I think he was half Persian, half British royal. He was some type of unification that had happened between two families, British royalty and the Persians. And then they married him to Khadijah, who was 20 years older than him, and then started his ballad like the Canterbury Tales. They except this time they could write it while he was alive. And so they did a much better job than they did with Jesus, with the after invention of Jesus Christ and trying to interpolate him back into Scripture. This time they could write it in real time, so they did a much better job with that one. And then they created Zionism, and that fulfilled some prophecies in Revelation. And a lot of people don't know that Revelation was originally written by Apollonius of Tyana, after he did a magnificent, miraculous disappearing act from the courtroom of Domitian, the last Flavian Caesar. So a real mean son of a bitch, Domitian was. He dipped John, the apostle, in boiling oil and then released him. Did this in public in the Colosseum in front of everyone to embarrass him, and then released him unharmed whenever John didn't do what he was told. And so once you understand that, you start going, what the hell's going on? John the Apostle was working for Domitian? And it seems like he was reluctantly doing it, right? So what we find is a lot of David Bowie type things that are slipped in to get past the goalie, so to speak, because you can tell John's not entirely on board with what he's doing, but he has to do it. And when he doesn't do it, he gets dipped in boiling oil, according to Tertullian, a later church father. So I started trying to figure out who this John character is, because there was no Englishman back then. And turns out John is Yohanan ben Zakkai, who anybody can go to any official source of history and find out this is not fringe. He willingly allowed himself to be kidnapped out of a genocide situation by Caesar so that he could be repurposed as the most powerful scribe and a surviving scribe in all of Judea, so that he could write the New Testament as John. So Yohanan ben Zakkai, the same guy who's credited with recreating Judaism after the temple was leveled, the Second Temple, was also John the Apostle, who created the New Testament in parallel with the redesign of a friendlier Judaism to Rome. And so he was working two functions for Caesar, and a dual role for Caesar that way. And then they had Josephus, who was a very profound scribe. And then they had Seneca and amazing other writers who were all consultants in the work that It started with the Piso dynasty. So a lot of people don't know this about Josephus. That's not his name. His name is actually Arius, and his middle name is Calpurnius, and his last name is Piso. And he was stop me if you need to. He was inserted by a tax collector family, one of the most powerful tax collector families. When he was like 7 years old, he was inserted into the enemy camp as under a guy that was like John the Baptist, named Bannus. And this old Bannus, teacher of righteousness, taught young Arius, everything that he needed to know about being a righteous teacher. And he went up through the ranks. Josephus did, or Arius did, and he got all the way to the point where he was a general over Galilee for the resistance, the Jewish resistance. And he was captured by Vespasian, and Vespasian had an assistant named Apollonius of Tyana. And Apollonius of Tyana whispered into Vespasian's ear and said, "You'd be better off keeping this guy than killing him. He's a very intelligent scribe, and he's very well versed, and he's a friend of your family. He's a Piso." And so Arius is adopted by the Flavians, and he's given the name Josephus Flavian. Where did the family of Josephus go? The Pisos. Nero executed 19 of them, nearly all of them. And we're told that they were executed for plotting against Nero, but it turns out that they were the reason for the fire of Rome. So all historians won't tell you this, but I'm going to go ahead and hang myself out there and say,
you mean the one they blame on Nero? The one there were multiple fires in Rome, but you're talking about the one that Nero was blamed for?
The one that Nero supposedly laughed during while the Rome was burning, that one. It happened in 66 AD or something, 64 or 66 AD. But what nobody knew what most people didn't know until Dr. Robert Eisenman came out with this information is that James the Just, the most important person alive after the crucifixion, was murdered by an illegal Jewish Sanhedrin that was called by Paul. And he pushed them into it politically, and then they did it when the procurator for Rome was out of office. The guy that would have protected James from this was not in office. So they were able to talk the high priest, Ananias, into getting a unanimous decision to stone James to death. And so they do that. They hide the whole story in Acts chapter 7 under the name Stephen, which means the crowned one. And that's the only part they had to change was the name. And then you miss the whole point of the story. But once you understand the secret decoder ring that that's James, Acts chapter 7 takes on a new life. But after they killed him, the reaction by the Jamesian Ebionite community was to burn Rome down. They didn't do it immediately. They started out by rebelling in different ways. But James was killed in 62 CE, just 2 or 3 years before people started burning Rome down. But what really got this cooking was the original Proto-Mark Gospel that was released by the Piso dynasty in 60. So 2 years before James was killed, the most powerful tax collectors, the same ones who had used their child to infiltrate their opposition, they were that ahead of the game. They decided to write a gospel that turned Judas into a figure named Iodokai or Yodakai, which became Jesus Christ, which is the letter I and the letter X, Iodokai. And they released this gospel showing the crucified person as a pro-money, pro-tax-paying person. And if you want to find it, you just have to look up the word. You use the word proto-mark, and it was their first attempt to release a gospel. And boy, it pissed off James's people, and it made them really step up their game. And then James stepped up his game, and he went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and walked right in front of the high priest and did the high priest's job and sat down and prayed for the people of Judah. And it pissed everybody off in the elitists so much that they killed him. And then in less than 2 years, Rome was burning. And of course we can't know why Rome burned down, because then the whole thing would unwind, right? So they give us all this bullshit about why Rome burned down. But that's how powerful the people that are controlling the narrative are. it doesn't matter if you go into the temple and you get yourself killed trying to remove money from it to teach people about what it does to the human body. They're going to turn it into a pro-money story. It doesn't matter if they're always going to take the beauty, that the ingenious of what the righteous do, what the soul does, and they're going to invert it for profit and control.
This sounds like I don't think all this information, this backstory, was in your Is Belial book yet.
No, I have a lot more information than what's in that book.
Okay.
That book would scare people away from it even more than it does now if I dropped it all. So, and I'm not doing it.
I think you should, honestly. My recommendation would be go deeper. I mean, I think that what you're exposing reminds me of Michael A. Hoffman a little bit. Michael Hoffman's work on the secret societies, psychological warfare, and secret societies, because you're helping people to start to see and recognize the nature of psi war, and how it's mostly based in inversions, right? So someone comes along and tries to warn you that how do you say that something's going to happen, and that person then becomes a terrorist, or becomes right. He becomes the one who starts it when it actually occurs, as opposed to the one who was trying to warn you. That's
Yes.
obviously one of countless examples of psychological warfare. So the point being that I think your research is so on point when it comes to the psychological games and the demonic inversions that are occurring historically, that you should really dive deeper into trust the research you're doing, right? Write it, put it out there. People will appreciate it. I really think that they will absorb it. And as I said, I think really connecting the ancient Chaldean cults around the manipulation of gods, and you name it, temples. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we would talk about. That the fact that the Greeks were basically being manipulated by Persia to essentially the Persian Empire to pay their coin to the temple, right? So it's like, oh yeah, you put your coin in an Apollo's temple, right? And then really, the priests are now holding, it becomes a bank, right? That becomes the bank, and you believe in, because the god's image is on the coin, right?
Yeah.
I think you could go endlessly deep into these topics, and I think I know that there's a huge audience that really would love to absorb it.
Well, one more thing that I said that I don't know that everybody caught, that I want you to make sure that you catch. The evidence that the same death cult that leveled the first Jewish temple, which obviously isn't the Jews, leveled the Twin Towers and the Solomon Building on 9/11. I don't know if you picked up on that.
No, I saw you said that, and I agree
Building
with that.
Building 7 was the Solomon Building, and the Twin Towers went down first. Then the Solomon Building went down, which was CIA headquarters, and the CIA was started by William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, who was a Knight of Malta for the Vatican. And
it wasn't CIA headquarters. The CIA had an operational office there, right?
They did, and it was also Rudy Giuliani's emergency man. It was overbuilt to withstand explosions, so that they could run it as an operation platform in the middle of a disaster. And it's likely that it was where the demolition took place from, and then they destroyed the control room.
Right.
But they ritually pulled off the same Tisha B'Av event that happened 2,600 years ago, where they leveled the Solomon Building and the Twin Towers that were out front, Joachim and Boaz. And so, I can't imagine that people would think that's a coincidence. It's the same death cult.
Yes, agreed. And just to understand, how do you see the death cult using Israel to the present day? Is it to create something apocalyptic, or how do you?
I'm glad you asked. For people that, for the sake of your time, if you go to the book, The 48 Laws of Power, The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene.
Yeah, Greene.
One clue I figured out when I was about halfway through that book is every single example that he uses as a man who's demonstrating these powers in the world. It's a knight. So it's a who's who of the knights. And so Robert Greene's a knight, likely. But in the 26th law of power, the cat's paw, the art of scapegoating, is basically where they explain the necessity for the invention of Israel. And I think that's only half the story. I think the other half of the story is that Israel was hurried into existence because the Dead Sea Scrolls were coming out of the caves at Qumran and threatening the entire narrative. And so they had to put up some form of real meaningful crime scene tape around this ongoing discovery that they weren't going to be able to just excavate all at once. They didn't know where they were going to come from next. They just knew that they were all there. And so they built the state of Israel to stop the destruction of their narrative from coming out of those caves. And they invented the Nazis to do it. And for those of you that know that the Nazis were invented by this organization and protected by them afterwards, they did it to create that state. And so they're behind that whole thing. And it is the 26th law of power. It's the perpetual scapegoat that never, it's like the Energizer Bunny. They can scapegoat it all day long, and everyone will be like, damn that Israel. Damn it, damn it, damn it. And then they'll go to church and give it money, not realizing that that's what created it. And as a distraction, the 26th law of power, it works so well. And there's also the second law of power in Robert Greene's book, the necessity of creating enemies, and how it makes you really up your game when you do. And another reason why I decided to write the book when I was a little afraid to before, because that book that they wrote, I'm actually using some of those techniques in my decision-making against them. But if you want to read the Celestine Prophecy, it's by Redfield. It is the Cliff Note book for dummies on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he did not want people to know that's what he was doing. He wrote this in the 90s. It was so popular. So many Christians read it and didn't even realize they were reading the teachings of the original crucified person in James when they were reading it. They knew they loved him. They knew they didn't fit with the Christian teachings, but they loved them because they were so true, right? But it's all about plant-based, reconnecting with the living waters, nature, and getting rid of government and meat and mind control, and starting to reconnect with your soul's potential here to commune and manifest the best destiny for yourself and your neighbors and all that stuff. And the 9 insights of the Celestine Prophecy basically cover the most important teachings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that was about all he could get away with in the 90s, was giving us that clue. But he changes the dates, the names, the country that it takes place in. But the rest of the story is Palestine before the necessity for Israel was discovered by the church, and then they created it. But the secret to getting out of all this is understanding the teachings that they don't want us to know about. The fourth philosophy, Pythagoras, and discovering your eternal soul through works like Dr. Michael Newton. The minute that everybody understands this, the whole facade starts to fall apart. And you come back into who you really are and what your real power is. And you don't need to wait for anybody else to do it. You can be the leader here. And, exactly. And that's what, and this book doesn't ask for belief at all. It stands on its own. It's uncontestable. I'm saying that publicly because there's no Christian that's ever been able to stand up in the light of day on one of these interactions, as nice as I am to people. They will not have this conversation, and I don't even think they know why they can't. But when I do get the right person who's smart enough to have this conversation against me on this, then I'm going to show people what a miniature exorcism looks like, and I'm going to do it nice. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be nice the whole time.
All right, beautiful. Well, thanks for your time. It's been fascinating talking with you, and as I said, I really look forward to the more that you put out. I think you have a lot of knowledge. Please share it with the world.
Thanks, Sean. It was great to be here.
That's my exhortation to you. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
You too.